Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
Orders to embark, then embarkation to where? Both 2 and 3 companies, incognito, no red berets, no stripes, no wings, just a bunch of private soldiers. Destination North Africa, but they knew not why. Those are the words of Sergeant Geoffrey Fowler of the Glider Pilot Regiment just prior to embarkation to North Africa in 1943. Welcome to another episode of Ham Jam. I'm Andy Bryant, and I'm joined as ever by my good buddy stateside, Kevin Getz. How you doing, Kev?
Andy, doing fantastic. How about you?
Yeah, not too bad. I'm looking forward to this episode, as ever.
Yeah, I'm totally looking forward to this.
So this episode is the first of 2 episodes to focus on Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. And join us to talk firstly about Operation BEGGAR, Turkey Buzzard, and the lead up to Operation LADBROKE. He's the author of Glider Pilots in Sicily, from which I've just read. And he's also our good friend, Mr. Mike Peters. Mike, it is great to have you back on the podcast.
It's really good to be back, guys. I'm really looking forward to it. It's great to be able to talk about this subject and good to hook up with you two again.
You know, it's nice to tackle a subject that probably gets very little or no press, so to speak, especially when it comes to Beggar and Turkey Buzzard. So this could be really informative. I think the listeners are going to get a lot out of it.
I hope so, and I agree. It gets overlooked as that happened. Unless you're inside the circle of the old GPRA and the veterans themselves, very few people talk about this. It just happened. Those gliders all got there by osmosis. And I used to talk to the Sicily veterans, and they talk about building those wackos in the middle of the desert. And Mike Hall was a good friend of mine. He flew one of the Turkey Buzzard Horsas, and he just matter of factly said, "Oh yeah, I was on that." And this is what happened. And then when you really consider it, it's wow. Every single aspect of it is mind blowing.
So before we actually go any further, gents, as we are sitting in our virtual pub, it is traditional to do the round robin and see what everyone's drinking tonight. Kev, what are you drinking?
I'm going with the Harp Lager.
Mike, what's your tipple tonight?
As we're in the Mediterranean, I've gone Italian tonight again, so it's Peroni in the Med.
Well, can you guess what I'm drinking, guys?
You know what? I just pencil them in. It's automatic.
I'm not going to shock you guys. I'm actually drinking, funny enough, Guinness. Anyway, cheers, gentlemen.
Cheers.
So, as Kevin is a trained journalist and also has plenty of experience in his current job of interviewing people, I'm going to let him take us forward. Kev, away you go, mate.
Well, I appreciate that very much, my friend. However, I decided we're going to get something off our chest, all 3 of us. I think we're all in agreement. And we're going to address this business about crash landing. I heard it again. I'm done with it. We are going to formally end it on this episode and get Mike's thoughts. And I'm going to go with, everyone knows what I do for a living. And I'm going to go with your Indiana definition. Also, it happens to coincide with the Indiana State Police definition of a crash. A crash is generally defined as a traffic collision, meaning a motor vehicle colliding with another object. This can include collisions with other vehicles, pedestrians, animals, road debris, or stationary objects like trees or buildings. With regard to a glider and the Horsa and the Hadrian, it is not a crash landing intentionally. It is a landing. If it hits an object, then it becomes a crash. Full stop. End of story. Please back me, Mike.
Yeah, I'm going to back you, Kev. And in aviation terms, even an emergency landing is a landing. A crash is uncontrolled and unintended. So it's a very different thing. It's just one of those things, people talk about gliders. Even some of the glider pilots themselves talked about crashing, but actually, because they crashed through fences. And, the original intention for the Horsa, as you both know, was to land without undercarriage on a central skid. But it was still a landing under control. You were aiming for a landing zone. It was intentional. So a crash in aviation terms, it's something, your engines completely fail, the wing falls off, something like that. But in terms of airborne landings, they are exactly that, landings, and it is a landing zone. So yeah, it's just frustrating when people say, yeah, they all crash. And you see that all the time on battlefield tours, battlefield studies, when you wander around some of these landing zones in Sicily and France and wherever, they say, oh yeah, they crashed here. And you say, no, they didn't crash. It's just really drives you mad, doesn't it? Yeah, I'm with you there.
So, it's time to put this to rest, as they say.
I think we may have done that, actually, mate.
If you applied it to paratroopers, did they fall?
Well, that's a good point.
They just crash out of an aircraft and throw themselves out? No, then they jumped and they landed. It was intentional on a green light. They jumped out intentionally onto a drop zone and they dropped into it. They didn't throw themselves out like someone off the top of a building or whatever. So,
very good point.
So that is done. We are finished. No more. A glider intentionally lands. It does not intentionally crash.
Yeah.
We're getting ready to discuss Husky, Mike. And I thought it was great when we were chatting before we got started. There is this notion that it just kind of happens. Obviously, there has to be some kind of lead up to Husky. We have to get gliders from point A to point B. What are we looking at, especially as it's related to the Horsa? Because I've tried to do comparisons with regard to how the Horsa, size-wise, give folks an idea of how big it is. And this is not something you easily stow away, throw in a ship, and you go to North Africa. So where are we looking at?
So no, it's not. And lift space on merchant shipping is at an absolute premium after North Africa. So we have Operation Torch, which finishes off the North African campaign. US forces and Free French and British forces all link up and the North African coast is secure. So now it's the big debate at Casablanca about what's next. The US want to go straight for Route 1, straight to Berlin, get over and done with and land in Europe. Churchill doesn't want that. He wins through. So Sicily becomes the target and there's all those things around. I think one of the things to bear in mind before we get started is this is a Montgomery plan. When you really start to dig down into the Sicily landings themselves and compare them to what happens 11 months later in Normandy, you can see the hand of Montgomery. And for all the bad press he gets, he is a great planner and a diligent planner. And the training and the planning for the intended 3 airborne operations of Ladbroke, Glutton and Fustian starts months back, way back before. And the logistics of that are difficult because the glider pilot regiment is not in a great shape. It's in its early days. We've had freshmen, which I discussed last time, not really an airborne landing. It's a special forces op using gliders, which goes horribly wrong, as we know. And so this is the first time we're going to try and use gliders. So there's a logistic part to that. And as is mentioned in the book here, that the US provides those Waco gliders, which are created in Western Africa and moves them across to North Africa, and then there's a whole saga of building them. But the pilots who arrive to fly these gliders have not flown for months in some cases, and very few hours, and have certainly not flown what we know as the Hadrian, the Waco, the Hadrian before. Why do they need horses? Well, they need horses because the Hadrian can't carry a jeep and a gun and can't carry a full platoon. And as the planning develops for these 3 operations, they all need a coup de main element, which involves platoons of infantry. So if you want to deliver a platoon in one place at one time, the Horsa, which is built around the airborne platoon, that was the original concept of the Horsa, is the aircraft of choice to use, the glider of choice, is the sole glider for the job. The Waco has its role and it's easy to assemble, but, and it's a big but, there aren't any in theatre. There are none in North Africa. And to ship them, they're twice the size of a Waco, sort of 80 odd feet wingspan, 68 feet long, breaks down to 37 major assemblies. And there's that famous photograph of them with all the workers around there. So you can't ship them assembled. You have to break them down. And there isn't the shipping and there isn't the time to get them from UK by sea to North Africa, because that would be dead time as well. Because if you're trying to train the crews to do that in modern days, thinking back to Kosovo campaign, and even I was talking about it, you train crews in one place and fly them in to do the op the next week or whatever. That's just not an option in World War II. So it is a huge logistical challenge just to ship them there by sea. But it's not going to happen. That option is not open.
Before we move on, Kev's already wanted to settle his gliders don't crash debate, which is fine. Can we settle the Waco debate as well?
Yeah, so I take my lead from Fred Corrie, who was a glider pilot, Sergeant Major in B Squadron, not on Varsity. And it's not a bloody Waco, it's a Waco. It's Weaver Aircraft Corporation of Ohio, and that's what WACO stands for. And quite a few of the pilots always said to me, they called it the Waco. Even the guys who flew them in the Med said, it's the Waco. And they were quite particular about that, but, you can see why people go, it's a Waco, because that makes sense. When you dig deeper, it's the Waco. But I'm always taking hits, particularly on the We Have Ways pod. Chalky says this, Chalky says that. Well, I'm sticking to my guns. I had it from the horse's mouth, the guys who flew it.
Okay, Mike, so we know we're going to have to figure out a way to get them from the UK to North Africa. And certainly this isn't something you just go, snap of the fingers, we're going to do this. What preparations or planning is being done, or any testing is being done to ensure that this is even capable?
Well, it's actually 1,350 miles from UK to Morocco. And we've got to bear in mind, it's a 3-stage operation. That's only the first leg. The accepted wisdom in late 1942, 1943, with the Horsa first come to service, is that no glider operation can be mounted with existing tugs beyond 1,000 miles carrying any load. So it's way beyond any known capability at the time. No tug in Royal Air Force service can fly that far with a glider. So when we say, we're going to move these Horsa gliders, and it's considered vital, and airborne forces, Hopkinson and Chatterton will say, we need the Horsa, because not only do we need it to do the coup de main with assault infantry, we also need it to carry the 6-pounders and the guns, because we know there's going to be an Italian or German armoured counterattack. So we must get get the jeep and the gun to the place. And if we look at Fustian, which we'll talk about later in the series, they want 12. So the lift capacity is vital. So it goes back and forth a few times. And this is why I say it's a Montgomery plan, because it becomes, no, this is a priority. We need to seize these bridges. We need to form an airborne corridor up the coast of Sicily and join up the bridges. So, how are we going to do that? And the only way to do that is with the Horsa glider. So the guys get sent away to look at that. And it's interesting when you start to see some of the personalities who are involved in this. What is still 38 wing, not 38 group at this stage of the war. RAF, who are the transport commander, are designated for glider operations. The guy who's given the task to sort this out is squadron leader Peter Wilkinson, who's the only surviving pilot from Freshman. He thinks, well, the only tug we've got that can get anywhere near that range is the Halifax Mark V, which is just coming into service with 295 Squadron, who up until this point had the really old, decrepit Whitley bomber. And at the start, they've only got 3 of those tugs converted to tow gliders. So they begin a series of modifications. How can we extend the range of the Halifax? And then how can we stick a glider on it to get out to beyond 1,300 miles, the longest leg of what will become Operation Beggar? They see how far will a Halifax fly. They do that from Boscombe Down. You start to get people involved like Flight Lieutenant Tommy Grant from Boscombe Down, who will be the guy who will train the Pegasus bridge crews.
Am I right in saying as well that some of them Halifax crews, the RAF pilots, hadn't actually flown Halifax before and had to train?
Yeah, the squadron was only just the beginning to convert to Halifax from the Whitley, and they were low priority because they weren't a bomber squadron, they were a transport squadron. So some of the guys who came, like Buster Briggs, who's a very accomplished pilot, only had 10 hours when they started to fly. And obviously they used the consumption trials to build up some flying hours, but actual intimate knowledge and experience of flying these aircraft was at a low level across the squadron, across 295 Squadron. And we mustn't forget that parallel to them is 296 Squadron flying the Albemarle. So these are not great aircraft they've had until this point. The Halifax was, at the time, quite a modern bomber, and the Mark V wasn't a bad example of a Halifax, but it's what was needed. These guys don't get enough exposure, don't get highlighted enough to what they do, because gliders go nowhere without their tugs. It's simple as, that's where you go. So that story started at Netheravon on Salisbury Plain, which I spent 2 years of my army service on that strip, on the very airfield, right in the middle of Salisbury Plain. And so 295 Squadron begin to modify their Halifax. And then, first of all, take out the mid-upper turret. Let's get rid of weight. Let's take the guns off them. So that's to lighten the load. And then they work out, we still need more. And they're literally flying around UK, saying, how many miles can we fly? How much further can we get each time up to Scotland around and doing these legs? Until eventually they come up with the idea of opening the bomb bay, taking out the bomb racks and fitting auxiliary fuel tanks into the bomb bay. So the bomb bay now becomes a huge additional fuel tank, which is not without risk. That almost doubles the weight of a Halifax with fuel. So what that means, and this is worth bearing in mind as we progress with the story, is that it can't fly on 3 engines. So if it loses one engine, it's going down with a glider. If it's towing a Horsa, an empty Horsa, anywhere, if it loses engine number 4, it can't stay up in flight. And if it crashes, to use that phrase, then the bomb bay is full of fuel. So this is hugely risky. And they carry out a series of what are called consumption trials flying around the UK, and that begins quite early on. I wrote some of the dates down in the day, so on the 1st of May 43 they've already started. So they move out of Netheravon because Netheravon is not suitable to do what they're going to do flying wise, so they move down to Hungsley South, which is 10 minutes flying time from Herne. And the reason they do that, they move down to Dorset, is because Herne is the heavy glider maintenance unit, so any modifications and maintenance needs to be done on these aircraft, because they rapidly work out the Halifax, when they crash and they have mechanical failures because of excess vibration about every 50 hours, they need everything needs to be tightened up, and this is going to be a 10-hour flight each way. So this, and all the trains that they work out, that they need to put extra maintenance crews on the Halifax, and that the Horsas need to be brand new, and the tow ropes absolutely need to be tip top if they're going to do this. And they're doing this for weeks, flying up and around the UK. So eventually they work out and develop the lighter load, the increased fuel load, that they can fly for 1,500 miles. And there's some interesting stuff that's in there, is that they take off from Hungsley South and they ditch the wheels to reduce drag. This is over, you can do the flight, and they land into Herne on the skid. And that's always the intention for Beggar and Turkey Buzzard, is to reduce drag, that they will ditch the wheels on takeoff with a little parachute on the wheels to get them down. The undercarriage will be dropped, and inside the glider will be a new undercarriage which will be fitted on when they get to Morocco, so they can carry on with the task. So there's a lot of thought goes into it, a lot of trial and development, and a lot of night hours, because it's against the clock. And even as late as 16th of May there's a crash killing all the Halifax crew and 3 glider pilots who were on board. Geordie Sumter Turn, Francis Davis and Richard Borton are on a ferry flight, and they're basically in a Halifax going from Holmesley South across to Herne, a 10-minute flight to pick up one of the gliders which had the undercarriage fitted again to bring it back to another series of trials. So because of the amount of fuel on the Halifax, there are no survivors, and that's an engine problem. So the key is the endurance and range of the tug.
We know also, because nothing is in a vacuum, we know the Germans are using gliders to help supply troops in the Africa Corps in North Africa. However, Allied fighters find them, shoot them down in a single day, and they said 16 tug glider combinations went down.
Yeah.
Is there anything getting funneled to the glider pilot regiment so that they're aware, hey, this is not going to be an easy thing. This could be highly dangerous.
What the trials illuminate, first of all, is it's physically demanding to fly for 10 hours in a glider. So there are going to be 3 pilots in each glider. So they're going to rotate the pilot. The third pilot did have a job, though. He had a Bren gun to be rear gunner on the Horsa should it be attacked as they flew across the Bay of Biscay. As you know, there's a panel at the back of a Horsa glider, escape panel on the tail. So the idea was to open that and they'd have the Bren gun there so that if an aircraft did attack them, which was highly likely, so flying across controlled German airspace in the Bay of Biscay, that they would use the Bren gun. They knew, and the 38 wing guys, the brief to them was, if there's cloud and we're intercepted by a Ju-88, which is not quite, but nearly a German Mosquito, it's quite an effective aircraft, or a Focke-Wulf Condor, which is their equivalent of a long-range thing like Sunderland with all its guns, etc., then we've only got a rear turret. We've taken our mid-upper gunner out. We've got no forward-firing guns. All we've got is the rear gunner. So we'll dive for cloud and hopefully lose it. If not, we're just going to have to cast you off and leave you over the Bay of Biscay. And that's the brief. And Mike Hall told me how he was told this story when I interviewed him, and quite sobering to think, yeah, you're going to get, but don't worry, we'll know where you drop off. And if we escape, we'll send your coordinates, which is what happened in one instance where, yeah, they knew where they dropped. But they knew that it was an issue. They did compensate for that because the mission was going to launch from Port Reith, right on the tip of Cornwall, as far southwest as you could get into the Atlantic in UK to extend the range as far as possible. We'll talk about that later, though. Difficulties are taken off from Port Reith. As they left over into the Channel and out to the Atlantic, they'd be met by a Beaufighter escort for the first 3 hours. So RAF twin-engine Beaufighters would escort them in waves of 3. So 3 Halifax Horsa combinations escorted by Beaufighters. But, and it's a big but, the Beaufighters were worried about being intercepted on their way back, low on fuel, and being attacked and bounced by Ju-88s or Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs. So they said, in order to avoid detection by German radar, we need to fly at 500 feet or lower. So the first 3 hours of the flight were at 500 feet over water. So you see, this is no straightforward thing. And I think I said to you before we started talking that everybody quite rightly piles praise on the Pegasus Bridge crews and Galpin and Brown and Ponte Grande. But I think this mission is right up there as an aviation achievement on the RAF crews and on the glider pilots as well, to fly this mission and do what they did, because it's 1,300 miles to Morocco, then they've got to go across to Tunisia, then they've got to climb over the Atlas Mountains on another flight, and these are 500-600 mile flags as well to get there. And then the RAF Halifax crews have got a ground crew have got to be waiting there with spare engines, spares, etc., service these aircraft and turn around and send them back. And there are so few Halifaxes that they've got to just keep going backwards and forwards in order to get the desired original target of 40 Horsas to North Africa.
Mike, have you ever had the opportunity to interview the Halifax crews? Because it would just be interesting, because this is not, okay, you're not flying into Germany overnight. This is something entirely different. Have you been able to converse with any of them and get their thoughts on what it was all about?
No, I spoke to Halifax crews who didn't fly the mission, who thought it was barking mad and high risk to strip all your guns out and fly into the Bay of Biscay, dragging a glider behind you into hostile air territory. That takes balls of steel, really. And some of them were shot down and certainly were intercepted. And the other thing to think about is, from a technical point of view, the best position to be in the glider was a high tow, because the turbulence from the 4 engines of Halifax was so great, and they found out later the Stirling. But a low tow was where they didn't want to be, particularly in cloud, etc. But if you're in a high tow, which is the preferred option of the two, the rear gunner can't use his guns. The tow rope's away. So if you're intercepted, you've got to try and remember to get into the low tow position so that the rear gunner can traverse and aim and fire his guns.
Mike, we're in a phase here with the glider pilot regiment where Roth is deceased.
Yeah.
He was killed in the training accident, and Chaverton is now the CO. So obviously his style of leadership, his thought process on the total soldier is coming to the forefront. What's the general consensus from the glider pilots with regards to that change?
At that time, the guys I spoke to didn't like Chaston. that much because, he was so different to Rock. Rock was a different animal altogether. He's I do what you do. He's an engineer by trade. He's got a different mentality. Chatterton's a guardsman and an ex-RAF guy as well. So he's a blue job and a wooden top, and all of that. And some of the guys, like I talked to Jock East, who flew on Sicily, he hated Chatterton. But because some of them blamed Chatterton for what happens later on Ladbroke. But, you could argue, if you look at the complete abject failure of freshmen on the RAF side and on the glider side, the guys that went on freshman were completely unprepared, flying-wise, for what they were asked to do. I was out last week on a US tour talking about the Eagle Squadrons and the guys who'd lied about what their flying level was and they adopted their logbooks, etc., to get into a hurricane and fly in about Britain. More power to their elbow, but actually you become undone then when you actually have to do technical things like flying cloud or flying instruments and fighting a dogfight, etc. So the state of the glider pilot regiment at the time is it exists. It's still suffering from that lag at the start when Churchill said, I want a glider force, and then there's no training aircraft, no airfields, no instructors, etc. And many of the guys who, when they get to North Africa, have not flown anything for 6 months. Although they're qualified, like 295 Squadron, they're at a very low level and are not really ready to do what's asked of them.
Are we seeing something very similar to the 1st Airborne Division between June and September? Morale issues creeping in, because idle hands. Hey, I want to be flying. I don't want to be sitting around.
This is a little bit, I joined to fly, and Chatterton's keeping them busy on the drill square and doing battle schools, learning to fire anti-tank guns and all these things. But yeah, there's an element of frustration. Where are the gliders when we're flying? And then there's this, where are we going? As that little bit that Andy read out at the start, there's a lot of frustration. Why can't I wear my red beret? Why can't I wear my wings, etc.? Why am I, and there's that transition from being a battalion. That hasn't happened yet. There's still battalions. It's still this very army mentality. And the aftermath of Sicily will be a road to Damascus moment for Chatterton when he realises, I need to co-locate my guys with the RAF, because what works well on Beggar and Turkey Buzzard is that the guys are living alongside the RAF crews that are towing them and are working with them all the time. So the guys who do this long-range mission to North Africa, I spend a lot of time on these consumption trials. They've been co-located at Herne and South Homesley with the RAF. So they've got to know the tug crews and they've got to understand it. And there's the professionalism is rubbing off each other. Well, all of them just said that the crash when they lost the Halifax and the glider in the preparation run brought a lot of them together because they all went to the funerals together. So that unified them and broke down any barriers that there were. Because, those early days, they're marching to their aircraft, going flying in their ammunition boots, come get back on the truck and go away. They're not integrating with the RAF as a cohesive unit.
This is infancy. This is growing pains. This is learning.
Absolutely.
An entirely new concept that nobody's ever done before.
This is why I wanted to write the Sicily book first, and I was kicking and screaming and wrote the Ireland book first, because this to me is the absolute moment, the aftermath of Ladbroke and Fustian, and the high point of Turkey Buzzard, and then it is to go from a standing start, freshman, disaster. Turkey Buzzard, okay, we got away with that. Ladbroke and all that happens there, gliders in the sea, and then Fustian, losses, but was successful. The whole question of airborne forces is big question mark, but the actual question of the glider pilot regiment existing in its current format is really up to debate. And Chatterton realises that, and that's why he hightails it back to the UK as fast as he can, to the War Office and to the Air Ministry, and brands the whole thing, resets the whole thing, and co-locates him with the Air Force. And he's the right man for the job because he's been in the Air Force. And he knows a lot of people. His peers are now running the Air Force. So whatever you think about Chatterton, and there were very mixed opinions amongst the veterans I knew, I don't think Rock would have achieved the same thing. And you've got to look at some of the other sharks around airborne forces at the time, Lathbury, Browning, Hopkinson's still alive. There's a lot going on.
Because we're still having this debate, aren't we, within certain military circles of what are we going to use these guys for? Yeah. Are they going to be for raids, or are we going to use them on larger divisional scale, which was something Andy and I had talked about in our Browning episode. Yeah. There are certain forces that are just like, no, this is going to be raid stuff only. And you have other personalities who are like, no, we want this thing to grow and blossom.
And Operation Husky is where that happens. Because, if you look at the initial planning for Operation Husky, it's small groups with gliders later for reinforcement. And that changes to Hopkinson's absolute obsession with using gliders first. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong terrain, all of that. But we're going to use them a lot. And we haven't learned a lot in North Africa. We've done battalion drops, which were really for no reason. This is the first time there's an intelligence preparation, there's a clear objective, and there's a clear plan about how and why we're doing it and what we're going to do with gliders. And you mentioned the German experience. Those guys being intercepted by the Beaufighters, that was his slaughter. that's the nightmare of the Bay of Biscay. Is like, okay, that could have happened to our guys if the Germans had tracked onto them. So that is a spectre over the whole thing.
So they've done the mods to the aircraft. They've done the trials, done some training. Can you actually take us through the operation?
Yeah, so they were by the 21st of June, 43. They've proved the 1,500-mile range can be done. They've also think they've overcome or done as much as they can to overcome the problem of what happens if we fly into cloud. 350 feet between tug and glider. If we go into cloud, how do we know where it is? So there's the angle of dangle indicator, and they've modified that and made a Mark II, which has got a gyro fitted to it, so that can give you angle of bank as well. And even then, there's still an incident. Well, I think it's on the first lift of 3 gliders where they have to climb up to 2,000 feet to get out of cloud above the 500, and when they come out of the cloud they're 50 feet above the tug, and so I think it's Briggs or Grant has to very carefully torque this glider back into position, because they hear all these stories from the boys, and some of them are obviously exaggerated about being in front of the tug and under the tug. How do you judge that in cloud when you go, there's nothing out there, you just got to one, and they don't trust the instruments, and the RAF guys struggle to get the glider pilots to trust this instrument. And I mentioned the issue with the tow rope and the rear turrets, so it's a real problem, but they're there. So they're going to start from Port Reith, RAF Port Reith, which is, I don't know if you've been there, but the airfield is right on the tip of Cornwall, and it's surrounded by either sea or hills, but it's as far as you can get, and they're sitting there waiting. And again, going back to my call, he talks about every day being told the Met forecast was bad, the cloud was bad, but not it, because they knew they had to have good weather to go. Conversely, good weather was good for the German fighters as well, so wings and roundabouts. But so when they did go, he took off the end of the cliff. So basically the runway ended in a cliff, 400-foot drop. So you're in a combination with a heavily laden Halifax, which can't fly on 3 engines. It's got 4 engines going. Thinking, okay, we're going to fly off the end of this cliff we're 350 feet behind it. And when the tug goes off the end of the cliff, bear in mind that glider is in the air first. The tug drops over the cliff and is momentarily out of view. And then the glider goes over and is out, drops as well. So glider 2 and 3 see the tug combination disappear over the cliff and then wait. See it come up again, which they do, So what on the third, one of the gliders, the third glider, I think it is, as they leave, they jettison the undercarriage onto the runway. And the third glider jettisons too soon, too low, and the undercarriage rebounds off the runway into the glider, and the oleo strut and one of the wheels is stuck in the elevator on the glider. That's all the way across the Bay of Biscay. They're looking at this thinking, okay, well, what are we going to do when we get there? How are we going to get down? Because this thing's stuck there. But hopefully it'll fall out. They meet the Beaufighter escort and they're on their way. 1,350 miles of 10 hours of flying, 3-man crew. So no small ask, I think. But before they leave, they know there are going to be 3 missions. They've already started to plan this, and that's how they know how many gliders they need, how many Horsas they want. Concurrently, all the WACO training is going on. The guys are self-assembling their WACOs in the African desert. They're doing air dry training, etc. And then they've got to get these small waves of Horsas to North Africa, to Morocco, to land on a skip, to be hopefully intact, have their new undercarriage fitted to service the Halifaxes, who will then go on leg 2 and leg 3. And some of the aircraft, the Halifaxes, will turn around and go back and have to fly across the Bay of Biscay, across Germany's airspace again to get back.
Just talking about the 3 pilots on the Horsa there, Mike.
Yeah.
Did they have like a set amount of hours that they would fly, or would they literally just swap around as they became...
I mean, it's funny, when you read all of their accounts, they all talk about sharing out equitably because everyone wants it in the logbook, and also being tired because, order is hard work to fly physically. It's not servo assisted. It's not designed for 10 hours of flying. But a lot of the guys got airsick and couldn't take control. So some of the guys did 8 hours of the 10 in their accounts because they then flown on such long flights. So that was the intent. And they did try and do that, did try and share. One crew spent 11 days in the dinghy. So Halifax is 1 shot down by enemy action. That was a Condor. 1 Halifax missing, and 1 that crashed on its way down to Port Reith. So bearing in mind there were very few Halifaxes. The Horsas, 1 shot down by enemy action, 1 missing. So that goes with the Halifax that was missing. 1 force landed into the sea, 1 brought back, and 1 written off, having got all the way to Saleh Airfield in Morocco, who's written off on landing. So you can see that all adds up. So looking at the legs, they've got to fly. After that, they've got to fly across to Froa, which is another 350 miles with their undercarriage. 2 gliders are lost in the desert on the way there, and then they've got to go from Froa to Kairouan, which is a 600-mile flight, and they're going to cross mountain ranges which are 3,000 and 4,000 feet high to get there. Given that the turbulence over those mountain ranges could make you drop at least sometimes as much as 3,000 feet, because the wind over the Alice Mountains was so dramatic, then you had to put a bigger margin over the top. And you need oxygen at 10,000 feet. And the guys flying the WACOs have to do that same transit. Some of them, it's the first time they've flown over mountains. So you can see the learning curve is steep, very steep, what they're being asked to do. The first glider gets there on the 28th of June. So that's not long before D-Day. given that they don't actually know when D-Day is. So they've got some hours by the time they get, but they're not practiced in coup de main ops, which is what they're going to be asked to do. And these guys, so it's a flight of 295 Squadron who've done the lead, the consumption trials, and are the lead on the tug side. And it's number 1 Squadron under Major Babe Cooper, who are the glider pilots who do Turkey, Buzzard, and Beggar as it is. So it's quite an ask, isn't it? It's a staggering amount of flight. And that's why I think it's such an important piece of aviation history.
Why do you think it's not known? Why is it so overlooked?
I just think because it's not sexy. It's not. Although there is combat, we all know. If you say to the uninitiated, if you say glider pilot regiment, what's the first thing they're going to say? Oh, Pegasus Bridge.
Pegasus Bridge.
Yeah, Horsa Bridge. And that's because of, the longest film and, all the other stuff required, and of course, Bridge Too Far. And even the guys who flew it were so modest about it. Yeah, I did that. I flew at the Bay of Biscay through German airspace in a canvas glider with a Bren gun for defence, being intercepted by Ju-88s and Focke-Wulfs, then I flew the Atlas Mountains. But my mates were building wackos in the middle of the desert. They really had it tough. The thing is, what they did enabled Ladbroke, because Ponte Grande would not have happened without Galpin and Brown and that Horsa they got through. Glutton was cancelled, and Fustian, which we talked about in a previous episode, that really was dependent on those 6-pounder guns being there to stop any German counterattack, because even dodgy Italian armour has a value of its own if all you've got is a Piat. By what some people might say about it. So I think it's a really important episode in glider pilot history. And going back to what Kev said earlier, I think it's part of the growing up thing where not only does it build flying hours, it builds confidence, it builds capability, and it shows the RAF what they can do. It shows the RAF what the glider pilots are capable of. It proves the Horsa, because even when they do the initial appreciation, they say, well, if you ditch, you need to get out quickly because it'll sink straight away. We've assessed that the nose will break off instantly. It'll sink. You need to get out. And when they do go down, those that do go down in the Bay of Biscay, they're quite quick to get out. It's like, oh, shit, we need to get out of this thing because it's going to sink. And then there it is still floating, and it won't because it's made of wood. It won't sink. And the tug signals where they are, and a flying boat comes back. Sunderland, amazing aircraft, comes in and says, well, the sea state's so rough, Sunderland can't land, so it just drops another dinghy and some more supplies and radios a position to a British destroyer, which turns up sometime later. And then they try and sink the Horsa. They try it with the light gun, they try it with the main armament. They can't sink it, it won't sink. And in the end, they ram it because they don't want the Germans to get it. This amazing aircraft. So, and the guys who spent the 11 days in the dinghy, that's a great story because they get recovered by a Spanish trawler and find themselves back neutral Spain, legally neutral. And there's a cock-up because when they get to the railway station to be met by the British ambassador, there's been some mess up, and it's the German ambassador that meets them in neutral Spain. So you can imagine what kind of that was like. So it's just, I don't know why it's not better known. Maybe somebody needs to write a book about it or something. Or do a podcast. Why don't somebody do a podcast about it?
We'll do that. We really should do that. Yeah.
I mean, we've sort of glossed over, well, we've done a bit of detail compared to what people normally do. I think it's important. At least people will go away now and look up Turkey Buzzard or Beggar, whichever you prefer to look. And Turkey Buzzard is the glider pilot nickname for it. The actual official operation is Operation BEGGAR. I think hats off to everyone, particularly some of these big figures in 38 Wing, which grows into 38 Group and will be the linchpin because, as I said earlier, you don't go anywhere without the tug getting you to the right place in one piece. And that's where the association builds, I think. Although after Sicily is when Chatterton realises and goes away. But I think it's already started from this operation across the Bay of Biscay because these crews are being pulled together and training together. It sets the template for what follows.
How many Horsas end up in North Africa?
So they end up in the end with about 30 plus in the end, but I think it's 21 operational when they're actually about to go up because of some of the damage. They wanted 40, so it's enough, just enough. They've got no shortage of wackos. The real shortage is tugs, because the American Troop Carrier Command on the initial part of Husky is going to be dropping Gavin's 82nd Airborne as well. And the reason that the Americans don't use gliders on Husky is because all the tugs and the gliders have been given to the Brits, because the Brits still think they're in charge of the war. And it's like, okay, we've got this, we've got the expertise, we're going to do this. If you read Gavin's diary, he's a regimental commander. He's not in commanding division, but they're not happy at all. Whereas our glider infantry aren't coming, we'll go out on our own. So they lose their gliders, because they're not gliders, but there's no tugs.
They've got their Horsas, they've got their wackos, and now the fun really begins because there's now lead up to Ladbroke. So, gentlemen, I think that is going to be a story for another episode. So, Mike, you're going to come back to speak about Ladbroke for us?
And it's a story you shall tell your grandchildren.
Yeah, because we have to definitely dive into this Hopkinson-Chatterton relationship.
Yeah, we do.
Because I definitely have a question I want to ask you about.
Well, there's other the other part of the formula is something you've already talked about, Browning, because Browning's there to start.
Yeah.
Browning goes back to UK. And there's Chatterton, Browning, and Hopkinson. And of course, Lathbury, all these people who we're going to see later. So, the Sicily book is out in paperback in October. And we have ways, won't we? So that's going to be...
Yeah, that's...
I've always said that absolutely has to be on your must-read list. It is a fantastic piece of literature.
The thing is, you mentioned it with Turkey Buzzard and Beggar. Nobody wanted to talk about Sicily, and it's still the ugly sister. It's like, oh yeah, and there was Sicily. But as you just pointed out, both of you independently, the lessons learned here and the formation are all around this. And the aftermath of Sicily, the Phoenix-like resurrection of the development, it all comes about. It's fortunate, use the cliche, the fires of Sicily and the disaster of Ladbroke and close run thing of Fustian, the bravery of Turkey Buzzard. It's just, you would think there's a moment when the thing, this glider thing's not working, let's get rid of them.
Yeah.
And it doesn't go that way.
Real quick, Mike, do you think part of that also is because, we all say it was disastrous, and believe me, yes, there are facts to say, but ultimately both bridges got captured. And is there some of that's in play here too? It's like, well, when the train runs on time, nobody complains about it.
Yeah, when we get to Ponte Grande, the bridges get captured and get lost. And then get captured back again. So with airborne forces, I always say it's a glass half full thing. If you're airborne forces, we can do that. We can do that. And that great interview with Urquhart after Arnhem. If we'd have known everything, we'd still have gone. Well, I take military groups, I stand in my Ponte Grande and say, is this a gamble or is it a risk? And that's the whole question with airborne forces. Are you gambling or are you taking a risk? And I think gliders at the time, you're reducing the risk is my philosophy on it.
Well, as I say, you're going to come back and do us the honour of doing those future episodes on Sicily. If our listeners are listening to this in July 2025, you'll be hearing that second episode in a couple of weeks' time. If you're listening to this in July 2026, then you can listen to it in a few seconds because it would have been out for ages. Anyway, Kev, I think we're getting the eye from the old landlord, mate.
Are we getting a load? I know he was not particularly thrilled with you this evening, so yeah, we probably better get out of here before we get thrown out or other compers calls.
What have I done? I've done it. Why is it always me?
I always blame you.
So anyway, before the landlord does actually chuck us out, because Kevin just had to get that last question in, and we're going to have to coach you on the whole concept of no spoilers, okay? So anyway, gents, we're going to call time, gentlemen, please, on another episode of Ham and Jam. Thank you all so much for listening. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, follow wherever you listen to us. It only leaves one thing, and that is to say cheers. Thank you, Mike, for joining us.
Cheers.
Yes. Thank you, Mike.
And Ham and Jam.
Ham and Jam.
Ham and Jam. Don't forget Horsa Bridge.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support us on buymeacoffee.com.
Those are the words of Sergeant Geoffrey Fowle of the Glider Pilot Regiment just prior to embarkation to North Africa in 1990. God, bloody hell, balls up already. I'll start again.